After 60, your energy is finite. Your time is finite, and your resources, financial, emotional, and physical, are no longer renewable in the way they once were. That reality changes everything about how you should move through relationships at this stage of life. What worked at 30, the willingness to overextend, to prove yourself, to sacrifice your own stability for the sake of someone else's approval, becomes unsustainable and often self-destructive after 60. Not because you're less capable, but because the margin for error has narrowed considerably. At this point in life, you are not building from scratch. You are managing what you've accumulated. And preserving what you've built requires a different kind of discipline than creating it did in the first place. This video is not about bitterness. It's not about avoiding women or dismissing the value of companionship. It's about something far more important: protecting your dignity, your leverage, and your autonomy in an environment where those things can be quietly eroded if you're not paying attention. Generosity is admirable, but generosity without discernment becomes weakness. And weakness, once established in a relationship dynamic, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. What I'm going to walk you through today are 10 specific behaviors that senior men should avoid, not out of fear, but out of principle. These are patterns that lower your position, compromise your independence, and create imbalances that rarely correct themselves over time. Number 10 is the most important because it addresses the single greatest vulnerability men face at this stage: the temptation to trade long-term stability for short-term emotional validation. Let's begin. Welcome to Femme Psychology with Emma, where we explore psychological realism over comforting fantasy. If you value clarity and principled living, subscribe. This channel is for men who lead their lives with intention. Before we get into the 10 items, it's important to establish context. Healthy relationships at any age are built on mutual contribution, respect, and reciprocity. Neither party should be consistently giving more than they receive. Neither party should be diminishing themselves to maintain the other's comfort. This is not about keeping score in a petty sense. It's about recognizing when a dynamic has become unbalanced in ways that compromise your well-being, your resources, or your sense of self. The behaviors we're about to discuss are not inherently wrong when done occasionally or in the right context. The problem arises when they become patterns, when they define the relationship rather than complement it. What you'll notice is that each of these behaviors involves some form of self-abandonment, abandoning your financial boundaries, abandoning your identity, abandoning your standards. And once that abandonment becomes normalized, it's very difficult to reclaim your position without significant conflict or the end of the relationship entirely. So this is not about controlling women. It's about controlling yourself. It's about maintaining the discipline to avoid behaviors that, while they may feel generous or loving in the moment, ultimately weaken your position and create resentment over time. High-value men, men who command respect and maintain their dignity, move differently. They operate from a place of sufficiency, not scarcity. They give from strength, not desperation. And that's the standard we're holding here. Let's look at the 10 things you should never do. The first thing a senior man should never do is abandon his financial independence for the sake of a relationship. Your financial stability at this stage is not a luxury, it's a necessity. You are working with fixed or limited income streams. Your ability to recover from financial mistakes is severely constrained, and once your resources are compromised, your autonomy goes with them. Abandoning financial independence can take many forms. It might mean merging accounts prematurely. It might mean taking on her debts or financial obligations without clear boundaries. It might mean funding a lifestyle that exceeds what you can reasonably sustain long-term. Here's why this matters psychologically. Financial independence is directly tied to decision-making power. When you lose financial autonomy, you lose leverage. You become dependent on the relationship in ways that make it harder to enforce boundaries, address problems, or walk away if necessary. Consider a realistic scenario. A man in his late 60s begins a relationship with a woman who suggests they pool their resources to simplify things. He agrees, believing it reflects trust and partnership. Over the next 2 years, Joint expenses increase. Her spending habits differ from his. He finds himself covering more than he anticipated, but raising the issue feels uncomfortable. Eventually, his retirement cushion, carefully built over decades, begins to erode. What started as a gesture of goodwill has now created financial strain and resentment. And because the accounts are merged, untangling the situation is far more complicated than it would have been if he'd maintained separation from the start. The principle here is simple. Maintain financial independence until there is absolute clarity, legal structure, and long-term stability. Generosity is fine. Dependency is not. Your financial autonomy is one of the most important forms of leverage you have. Protect it. The second thing you should never do is prioritize her approval over your own self-respect. This is subtle, but it's one of the most corrosive patterns men fall into, especially men who have been alone for a period of time and are grateful for companionship. It shows up in small compromises. You adjust your opinions to avoid conflict. You soften your standards to keep her happy. You tolerate treatment you wouldn't have accepted in the past because you don't want to risk losing the relationship. Over time, those small compromises accumulate, and what you're left with is a version of yourself that's smaller, quieter, and less authentic than the man you were before the relationship began. Here's the psychology. When you consistently prioritize someone else's approval over your own self-respect, you train them to see you as accommodating rather than grounded. And accommodation, while pleasant in the short term, does not generate respect. It generates entitlement. A realistic example. A man begins dating a woman who frequently makes dismissive comments about his hobbies, his friends, or his preferences. He laughs it off initially, not wanting to seem sensitive. But over time, he stops mentioning those things altogether. He adjusts his behavior to avoid her criticism. What he doesn't realize is that by doing so, he's signaling that his preferences are negotiable and that her comfort is more important than his integrity. Eventually, she loses respect for him, not because he was accommodating, but because he had no bottom line. The corrective principle is straightforward. Your self-respect is non-negotiable. If maintaining a relationship requires you to consistently abandon your standards or tolerate disrespect, the relationship is the problem, not your boundaries. Approval is nice. Self-respect is essential. The third thing senior men should never do is isolate themselves from male friendships for the sake of a relationship. This happens more often than most men realize. A new relationship begins, and gradually, time with friends becomes less frequent. Invitations are declined. Long-standing traditions fade, and over time, the man finds himself increasingly reliant on the relationship for social connection and emotional support. This is dangerous for several reasons. First, male friendships provide perspective. They offer a sounding board that exists outside the relationship. They remind you of who you were before the relationship and who you are independent of it. Second, isolation increases dependency. When the relationship becomes your primary or only source of connection, you lose leverage. You become more willing to tolerate dysfunction because the alternative feels like total isolation. Third, strong male friendships are protective. They provide emotional regulation, accountability, and continuity that relationships alone cannot offer. A realistic scenario: a man in his early 70s reconnects with a woman after his wife's passing. Initially, he maintains his weekly poker game with friends he's known for decades, but over time, she expresses subtle dissatisfaction when he goes. "You're always gone on Thursdays," she says. He begins skipping occasionally to keep the peace. Eventually, the tradition stops altogether. 2 years later, the relationship has become his entire social world, and when problems arise, he has no external support system to turn to. He's effectively trapped by his own isolation. The principle: never allow a relationship to become your only source of connection. Maintain your friendships, protect your routines, guard your independence. Men who remain connected to other men retain perspective, leverage, and emotional stability. Men who isolate lose all three. The fourth thing you should never do is overshare vulnerabilities too early in a relationship. Vulnerability has become a celebrated concept in modern relationship advice. And while appropriate vulnerability is important in established, trust-based relationships, premature vulnerability is often a mistake, particularly for men. Here's why. Vulnerability, when shared too early, can be perceived as weakness rather than authenticity. It can shift the power dynamic before respect has been firmly established, and once that shift occurs, it's difficult to reverse. This doesn't mean being emotionally closed off. It means being strategic about what you share and when. Trust is earned over time. Emotional intimacy should deepen gradually as someone demonstrates that they can handle what you share without using it against you, losing respect for you, or becoming uncomfortable with you. A realistic example. A man eager to build connection quickly shares details about his financial struggles, his health anxieties, and his regrets from his first marriage within the first few months of dating. He believes this is building intimacy. Instead, she begins to see him as fragile. Her tone shifts. She becomes less deferential. Over time, the dynamic tips in her favor because he revealed too much before she had demonstrated that she could hold that information with care. The principle here is measured disclosure. Share vulnerability in proportion to demonstrated trustworthiness. Let the relationship earn your openness, not the other way around. Strength is not about emotional unavailability. It's about emotional discipline. The fifth thing you should never do is fund a lifestyle you cannot sustain long-term. This is particularly relevant for senior men because your income is largely fixed. What you commit to now, you'll be expected to maintain indefinitely. And if you set a standard you can't keep, the relationship will either deteriorate or you'll exhaust your resources trying to preserve it. Funding an unsustainable lifestyle often begins innocently. You want to impress her. You want to show generosity. So you take her to expensive dinners, pay for trips, cover costs that stretch your budget. Initially, it feels good, but over time, it becomes expected. And once expectation is established, pulling back feels like a betrayal, even if the original standard was never realistic. Here's the psychology. When you establish a pattern of high spending early on, you set a baseline. That baseline becomes the norm, and reducing it later signals decline, stinginess, or loss of interest, none of which are true, but all of which create conflict. A realistic scenario. A man begins dating a woman and, eager to make a strong impression, pays for frequent upscale dinners, weekend getaways, and gifts. She becomes accustomed to this level of treatment. A year later, his budget is strained. He suggests more modest activities. She interprets this as a lack of interest or affection. Tension builds. The relationship is now built on a financial foundation he can't maintain, and adjusting feels impossible without damaging the dynamic. The principle: never set a financial standard you can't sustain comfortably for the long term. Generosity should come from surplus, not strain. If maintaining her interest requires financial performance, the interest isn't real. Live within your means. And if that's not enough for her, she's not the right fit. The sixth thing you should never do is chase validation through gifts. Gift giving is a normal part of relationships, but when it becomes a tool to earn affection, maintain interest, or compensate for a lack of emotional connection, it becomes a problem. Men, particularly those who feel uncertain about their value in a relationship, sometimes default to material generosity as a way to secure a woman's approval. They give gifts not out of genuine generosity, but out of insecurity. And women can sense the difference. A gift given from abundance feels entirely different than a gift given from desperation. The former is appreciated. The latter is often exploited. Here's why this matters. When you use gifts to buy affection or approval, you establish a transactional dynamic. She learns that giving less emotionally results in receiving more materially, and that pattern rarely leads to genuine connection. It leads to exploitation. A realistic example: a man worried that his girlfriend is losing interest begins buying her expensive jewelry, paying for spa treatments, and offering other gifts without occasion. She accepts them, but her emotional investment doesn't increase. In fact, it decreases because he's signaling that he doesn't believe he's enough on his own. The corrective principle is simple. Give from sufficiency, not scarcity. If you feel the need to buy someone's affection, the affection isn't real. Generosity should enhance a relationship, not sustain it. The seventh thing you should never tolerate is public disrespect. How a woman speaks to you in front of others tells you everything about how she actually sees you. Public disrespect, whether it's subtle dismissiveness, sarcasm, contradiction, or outright criticism, is a boundary violation that should never be normalized. Here's the psychology. When a woman disrespects you publicly, she is signaling to everyone present, including you, that you are beneath her. And if you tolerate it, you confirm that signal. Public respect isn't about ego. It's about maintaining a standard. If someone cannot speak to you with basic regard in front of others, the relationship has a fundamental problem. A realistic example. A man is at a social gathering with his girlfriend. He shares an opinion, and she interrupts him to correct him in a condescending tone. "That's not how it happened," she says, smiling at others as if he's confused. He laughs it off to avoid confrontation, but internally he feels diminished. Over time, this becomes a pattern, and each time it happens, his position weakens. The principle: address public disrespect immediately and privately. Make it clear that how she speaks to you in front of others is non-negotiable. If it continues, the relationship ends. Respect in public reflects respect in private. If one is missing, both are. The eighth thing you should never do is cancel your purpose for the sake of romance. Purpose, whether it's a project, a hobby, a business, a creative pursuit, or simply a structured use of time, is what gives life meaning beyond relationships. Men who abandon their purpose to accommodate a relationship often find that they lose not only their sense of identity, but also the respect of the woman they made that sacrifice for. Here's why. A man with purpose is attractive because he has a center of gravity that exists independent of the relationship. A man without purpose becomes emotionally dependent, and dependency is not attractive. A realistic scenario: a man has spent years building a small woodworking business in retirement. It gives him structure, income, and pride. He begins a relationship, and she expresses frustration with the time it takes. Wanting to prioritize the relationship, he scales back. Eventually, he stops altogether. Within months, he feels aimless, and she, rather than appreciating the sacrifice, begins to see him as less compelling. The principle: never abandon what gives you meaning. A woman worth keeping will respect your purpose, not resent it. Romance should complement your life, not replace it. The ninth thing you should never do is rush commitment out of loneliness. Loneliness is a powerful motivator, and after years of being alone, whether through divorce, widowhood, or circumstance, the desire for companionship can cloud judgment. But making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions is one of the most costly mistakes a man can make at this stage of life. Commitment, whether it's cohabitation, marriage, or financial entanglement, should be the result of careful observation over time, not emotional urgency. Here's the psychology. When you commit prematurely, you bypass the vetting process. You overlook red flags because you don't want to risk losing the connection. And by the time the truth reveals itself, you're already legally, financially, or emotionally entangled. A realistic example: a widower, after 3 years alone, meets someone who makes him feel seen again. After 6 months, she suggests moving in together. Eager to avoid loneliness, he agrees. A year later, he realizes they're fundamentally incompatible. But now they share a lease, joint expenses, and entangled routines. Exiting is far more complicated than it would have been if he'd waited. The principle: take your time. Loneliness is temporary. Bad commitments are not. Patience protects you. Urgency exposes you. Now we come to number 10, and this is the most important principle of all. Never trade long-term stability for short-term attention. This is the mistake that undoes more senior men than any other. It's the choice to prioritize how a relationship feels in the moment over what it costs in the long run. Attention feels good, especially after years of invisibility or solitude. When someone makes you feel desired, valued, or seen again, it activates something deep. And that activation can override reason. But attention is not the same as value. Attention is not the same as respect. And attention, if it comes at the cost of your financial security, your independence, your peace, or your dignity, is not worth it. Here's the psychology. Short-term attention triggers dopamine, the reward chemical. It feels immediately satisfying. But long-term stability requires serotonin and prefrontal planning. It requires delayed gratification, patience, and the ability to choose future well-being over present pleasure. Men who sacrifice stability for attention often realize the mistake years later when the attention has faded, the relationship has deteriorated, and the stability they gave up is gone permanently. A realistic example. A man in his late 60s meets a woman who showers him with affection early on. She's attentive, affectionate, and makes him feel younger. Eager to keep that feeling alive, he finances trips, helps with her expenses, and eventually moves her into his home. 2 years later, the affection has cooled. But now she has legal claims to his property, access to his finances, and leverage he didn't anticipate. The attention he craved cost him his autonomy, and recovering it may no longer be possible. The principle is this: evaluate relationships based on what they cost you over time, not how they make you feel in the moment. Ask yourself, does this relationship strengthen my position or weaken it? Does it add to my stability or threaten it? Does it respect my boundaries or erode them? If the answer to any of those questions is negative, the attention is not worth the cost. Because at this stage of life, stability is everything. And once you lose it, you don't get it back. These 10 principles are not about avoiding relationships. They're about protecting what you've built while remaining open to genuine connection. The difference between a high-value man and a desperate one is discipline. It's the ability to say no when something looks appealing, but compromises your foundation. It's the willingness to walk away from attention that comes with strings attached. You've spent decades building stability, identity, and independence. You don't owe anyone access to those things simply because they show you affection. Generosity is admirable, but generosity without boundaries is self-destruction. The principles outlined here are not rigid rules, they're protective guidelines. They help you move through relationships with your dignity intact and your leverage preserved. And here's the truth that no one talks about. Women respect men who have standards. They respect men who can't be bought, manipulated, or swayed by temporary validation. So hold the line. Maintain your principles. Give from strength, not need. And never, ever trade your long-term peace for short-term approval. Because the men who do that don't just lose relationships, they lose themselves. And at this stage of life, that's a cost you can't afford. If this resonated with you, comment below which principle hit hardest. I want to know what you're thinking. And subscribe to Femme Psychology with Emma for more no-nonsense psychological guidance built for men who lead with intention. Tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know who's part of this conversation. I'll see you in the next one.